Hi, I'm Rebecca Valcarcel, and I'm here with a poem by Tracy Smith called The Good Life. And this poem is featured on Poetry 180, which is a website I totally recommend checking out. And this is poem number 2 in that group, The Good Life. When some people talk about money, they speak as if it were a mysterious lover who went out to buy milk and never came back. And it makes me nostalgic for the years I lived on coffee and bread, hungry all the time, walking to work on payday like a woman journeying for water from a village without a well. Then living 1 or 2 nights like everyone else on roast chicken and red wine. I really like this poem for a number of reasons. One is that it reminds me of times when I had to count every penny. You know, when I went to the grocery store, adding up the price of every item to make sure I had enough to cover the bill at the end. And so I can relate to it, and maybe you can. But more than that, I really love the title and how it's actually kind of surprising us because it's called The Good Life. And when we're in the penny pinching stage of our lives, and maybe we are multiple times in our lives, but in times of lack and loss, we tend to imagine that everything will be fantastic and perfect if only we had a little more money, or if we only could afford the chicken and red wine every single day. And we might even think that most people have that experience and that we're just like the unusual one. Everyone else gets to have good dinners and meals all the time. And we're the ones with the ramen noodles and the macaroni and cheese and but this poem sort of turns that upside down. Let's go through it just in sections here. When some people talk about money, they speak as if it were a mysterious lover who went out to buy milk and never came back. So some people have this relationship with money where it just disappears on them and they're not even sure where it went. Um, Now, there might be some advice we might have for these folks, you know, how to get their budget in line or whatnot. But sometimes you really can't, you aren't in a position to judge or even give advice. But she's saying some people do talk to her about money and they seem to just not understand why it disappears and where it goes. And, you know, instead of her moving into some sort of advice or giving them some kind of lecture, you know, she lets it lead her to a happy memory. And she says, it makes me nostalgic. Nostalgia is a feeling we have when we look back with fondness. So she looks back to a time in her life when she also was poor and she also had trouble making ends meet. She says, for years I lived on coffee and bread, very cheap things, very economical things. She says she was hungry all the time and she walked to work on payday. Presumably, she lived in a place where you could, you know, either ride to work or walk, and walking is cheaper. And so she walked. Um, Maybe it was the subway or the bus or I don't know, taxi, Uber. But she had to walk, and she was like a woman journeying for water from a village without a well. Like those days were like having to walk to get to water or to get to your job so you could get a little bit of money to bring back. Because where you live, there's not a well. Like there's not a sense of plenty, there's not a stable source of nourishment. So she remembers those days when that's what it was like for her. And then she remembers payday because it says then, living 1 or 2 nights like everyone else on roast chicken and red wine. So roast chicken is very different from bread and coffee, right? And red wine is nicer than coffee. So she lived for a couple of nights on very fancy food. Well, I mean, not horribly fancy, but you know, like upper level food. And then the rest of the month, she's going back to her ramen noodles and, you know, spaghettios and stuff. But the sweetness of the poem for me is that she remembers this fondly. And so the title, The Good Life, doesn't necessarily refer to the life she has now. Now she's stable, presumably money is no longer just disappearing magically. She knows where it is, and she has some. But she remembers with nostalgia, with fondness, to when that wine tasted so good, because she didn't have it all the time. That chicken was very special because it only came at payday. The living in lack makes you so appreciative when you do have extra or enough, plenty. And so, in a lot of ways, that was the good life back when it all felt so wonderful to have the chicken and red wine. And now maybe she takes it for granted. I mean, she doesn't really elaborate, but once you have things, it's not special anymore. You just assume you'll always have it now. And so it loses its shine. So I really think this is an interesting poem because the good life seems to be referring to uh, a life of plenty and plenty of money. But she's actually saying, no, you know what, that was the good life. When I was hungry and I was struggling, but I so appreciated the times when I had enough and had something special. Yeah, makes us wonder, what do we really truly want? Do we want, if we can live with appreciation and thankfulness all the time, maybe that would be desirable. Maybe that would be a good life. Well, you can tell me what you think in the comments and join me for another poem soon.